So in this video, I want to introduce another kind of different way of thinking about how to cluster in the first place. It makes a very different assumption about how clustering should work and is a very powerful method for thinking about how to model very complex relationships. This idea of hierarchical clustering kind of rests on this idea that many categories or many clusters of objects have some kind of hierarchy to them. This example is showing a really complicated kind of relationship between concepts, namely that like an entity is like a type of thing, and entities could be physical entities, which might be an organism, which could be a plant, which could be an herb, which then could be basil, this example of an herb. But this idea that there is actually structure and that different plants might be related to each other under the subcategory plant, plant might be under organism, and then there might be other things under organism. This idea that maybe clusters have a hierarchy to them can actually be a really useful idea in trying to model how clusters work. And that's our idea here, is trying to take some notion of hierarchy and applying that to our clustering. Another example is thinking about the tree of life. I kind of was talking about organisms already, but you can imagine like animal kingdoms, how there's a relationship between different branches of animal kingdoms and different species inside of that. So lots and lots of types of naturally occurring hierarchies when thinking about clustering. That some things are very specific versions of something that might be an example of a more general thing, and you might have this kind of rank structure. So instead of just trying to learn a discrete number of clusters, like put everything into K clusters, we're going to try to, in some sense, avoid that in the first place. We're not going to choose a number of clusters. Instead, we're going to try to learn one of these hierarchy trees, showing the most simple example of something to the most general example of something. And we're going to use this kind of tree diagram that we call a dendrogram. Dendrogram is this kind of tree visualization that shows different granularities of these clusters. And we're going to use kind of this as a very general framework. There's lots and lots of different approaches to try to learn this dendrogram. There's also many different ways of trying to model these things, like how we talk about how similar two objects are. Now, we're going to allow us to use many, many different types of distance metrics for this, where k-means is really focused on Euclidean distance. And it also will commonly be able to find more complex shapes that k-means would not. So, for example, k-means is able to find these spherical clusters that all are the same size and hopefully not overlapping. I introduced in the last video this notion of a mixture model, which is a more general version of k-means. It's a lot more complicated. We didn't explore the math, but it's the same idea of trying to assign clusters. Now, mixture models still fail with some of these weird shaped-looking ones, and we'll see today that hierarchical clustering is able to approach these types of clusters, where there might be something else at play than just raw distance that determines clustering. That there might be some relationship between points and how points differ, and we'll see how hierarchical methods will be able to solve this type of problem, where mixture models, which we didn't really talk about, or k-means would just fail to do. Now, there are generally two types of hierarchical clustering models that try to learn this kind of dendrogram that then can help you determine kind of where you want to cluster things. The two methods primarily differ in where do you start. So we're going to talk today in this video about this first one called divisive or top-down clustering, and then in class we'll talk about agglomerative clustering or bottom-up. Divisive clustering is saying, hey, start with all of the data in one cluster, and then keep breaking that cluster up into smaller and smaller pieces until you're happy. So start with all the data in one big cluster, and then recursively split it up over and over again to smaller and smaller clusters. And the algorithm we'll mention today is recursive k-means. The alternative, the one that we'll talk about in class, is agglomerative clustering or bottom-up. The big idea there is every data point starts in its own cluster, and then somehow come up with a strategy for merging clusters together until they're all in one big cluster. And the example algorithm we'll talk about here is single linkage, but we'll talk about that in class. Okay, so divisive clustering. Let me give you an example of what this looks like. The idea is start with all of the data in one big cluster. So if you wanted one cluster, you have all the data. That's a pretty simple. But then what you'll do is you'll repeatedly divide the data up by using k-means. So you'll start maybe picking some splitting factor like 3, run k-means to break them into 3 subclusters, and then once you have those 3 subclusters, run k-means to break those up into 3 more subclusters. And you keep doing this over and over again. You can make this more complex with mixture models. K-means wouldn't find these exact clusters, but you keep recursively breaking them up into smaller and smaller clusters, each time only looking at one cluster and splitting that up again. And this now finds you this, in some sense, kind of dendrogram. It's a little hard to see here, but you kind of started off with everything in one level in the same cluster. And then you broke them up into 3 clusters. Broke them into 3 parts, and then you broke those 3 parts into so on and so on and so on and so on. You keep breaking it up over and over again, and it helps you form this kind of tree structure. I think visually, it helps to see that if you think about documents as being like a set of documents, you might start by splitting it up into athletes and non-athletes. How would it choose this? It's a little bit complex. But you can imagine that you might break it into 2 groups. You have all the athlete articles and then the non-athlete articles. And then you might recursively break those up. Maybe athletes get broken up into baseball or soccer and hockey, and non-athletes, maybe musicians, artists, actors, or scholars, politicians, and government officials. And you can keep breaking it up smaller and smaller again. The details, how to do this, really depend on specifics of algorithms and the assumptions your model makes. But the idea for most of the divisive hierarchical clustering models is start with everything together and have some mechanism to break them up into smaller and smaller pieces repeatedly. We are not going to focus too much on divisive clustering in this class. We're really going to focus on this agglomerative case, the one of merging it together, because it's a bit easier to conceptualize and a bit easier to actually write the algorithm. So I just want you to know that there is a top-down approach, one that takes all the data in one cluster and keeps breaking it up into smaller and smaller pieces. But we are not going to focus on that in this class. We're really going to focus on the one I'll introduce in class, agglomerative one. Now, there's a lot of choices you have to make with divisive clustering that won't be unique to divisive clustering, that might also apply to agglomerative. But it's good to highlight that. In particular, which algorithm to use to split them up. I mentioned k-means, but you might want to use a mixture model or something else. Also, how many clusters you split up each time, maybe use a variable amount or a fixed amount. And then also deciding when to stop splitting. So what's the largest cluster allowed? Or how large is a cluster allowed? Or maybe you have a specific number of clusters you're looking for. Lots and lots of choices about what's the right thing. Note, there's not going to be a lot of right answers because in this unsupervised setting, we don't really have any answers. So here we might find a lot of ambiguity, but this could be a helpful approach. Now, that's all I want to talk about for divisive clustering today. In class, we'll talk about this other approach, and it'll be a lot more concrete, thinking about agglomerative, building from the bottom up.